Welcome back to meeting number 21 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today, after having heard from parliamentarians from Ukraine, we will continue the discussion which began on Monday, May 16th, 2022. As always, interpretation is available through the globe icon at the bottom of your screen, and for members participating in person, bear in mind that the Board of Internal Economy's guidelines for mask use and health protocols are still being followed. Before speaking, I would ask each member to please wait until I recognize them by name. And when you are speaking, please do speak slowly and clearly. And when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. A reminder that all comments made by members should be addressed to the chair. Now, as you're all aware, we will be resuming debate. More specifically, we are now dealing with the sub-amendment that was introduced by Mr. Bergeron. And as you will recall, there was a speaking list, and I will just run down those names. On the current speaking list, we have Mr. Oliphant, Mr. Perkins, Ms. Gray, who's not here with us today, and Mr. Jennis. Mr. Oliphant?
Sorry, point of order. Mr. Perkins had the floor when we
sorry?
Mr. Perkins had the floor when we adjourned.
Those are not what the clerk has informed me of.
I mean, there's a transcript. It'll be very clear that Mr. Perkins had the floor, so you can verify, please.
You want to suspend for a moment?
If we could suspend for a moment. Mr. Perkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just for those who may be watching on ParlView, just to go over exactly what it is we're debating here. As I understand it, it's a sub-amendment to Ms. Fry's original amendment, or motion, that deals with whether or not at the end of Ms. Fry's motion we should add a portion that says that the committee needs to finish or complete its work on Ukraine vaccine equity and Taiwan, studies that are already underway, before considering or proceeding with Ms. Fry's motion. And when I was speaking for only a few minutes last time, I had told some of the members a bit about my personal history, just a small piece, not the full resume. I was accused of giving my full resume. I can do that a little later if you like. But I think it's important to step back and understand that the sanctions that we heard a lot of discussion on today in the meeting with officials from Ukraine, and the sanctions that the government has implemented all come from an act called the Special Economic Measures Act. And that act hasn't existed forever in Canada. It actually existed and was created after the coup in Haiti. I was part of that creation of this act, as I was the senior policy advisor, as I said in the last meeting, to the foreign minister of the day, Barbara McDougall. And the context of 1991-92 is important in understanding the purpose of the act and how governments can or cannot use it. Prior to that time, Canada had imposed sanctions a number of times, but it didn't have a standing act of parliament to do it with. So, as an example, in the early 80s, when the government of Prime Minister Trudeau had to impose sanctions on Iran with the Iran hostage crisis, they had to bring a special act to Parliament to have it pass through the House and the Senate to get authorization to do that. The same in 1985, 1986, when Prime Minister Mulroney decided to try and lead many other nations in imposing economic sanctions on the apartheid regime in South Africa. That required a special act. So in those days, prior to 1991, Canada was not even a member of the Organization of American States, because the Organization of American States, which dealt with the issue of Haiti and the sanctions bill that came out of it, Canada wasn't a member because primarily there were a lot of, I'll say, despots and dictators, and not exactly a democratic hemisphere for many years. In 1991, we were in the unusual situation where 34 of the 35 Western Hemisphere countries were now democracies for the first time in the Western Hemisphere, and for the first time Canada joined the Organization of American States. And I was with my minister then. It was one of the first international meetings she went to as foreign minister was in June 1991 in Santiago, Chile. And in Santiago, Chile, that was our first meeting, Canada with the OAS. They passed something that's become known as the Santiago Declaration. And in June 5th, 1991. And that declaration said that we were to instruct the Secretary General of the OAS to call for an immediate convocation of meeting of the Permanent Council of the OAS in the event of any occurrences given rise to the sudden or irregular interruption of a democratic political institutional process or of the legitimate exercise of power by the democratically elected government in any of the organization's member states, in order, within the framework of the Charter, to examine the situation, decide and convene an ad hoc meeting of the Ministers of Foreign Affairs or a special session of the General Assembly, all of which must take place within a 10-day period. So that was a revolutionary statement for the Organization of American States in 1991, given the history of the Western Hemisphere. And that was in June. Then in the summer of 1991, in August to be precise, we had a coup in Moscow with Mikhail Gorbachev. And the world took note as he was trying to implement Glasnost and Russia moving towards a more open and market-based system. The military took over for a period of about a week. We didn't know where Mikhail Gorbachev was, and the military was in charge. Excuse me. Mr. Chair, the government of the day, again, Prime Minister Mulroney, vehemently opposed that and demanded the return of Mr. Gorbachev.
Mr.
At
Chair,
the end of September.
point of order. I know that you have been very lax and liberal with respect to relevance. However, we are on a sub-amendment to the motion, which very specifically does two things. It deletes a reference to the completion of a study, and it furthers the thing. And I have no idea how anyone on this committee, in this room, in this world, could possibly find relevance between what the honourable member is saying and the sub-amendment which is before us at this time. And I know that you give lots of latitude on that. However, I think that there is some time when you can rule it out of order and ask either the member to move on, to speak to the sub-amendment, or to actually end the member's time, which has been done by some chairs at times, notably me, to say it's time to move on. That can be done, and I think that's very important because I think we want to show that Parliament is relevant. And if Parliament is not relevant because conversation is completely irrelevant, then we don't have the ability. I know you have latitude to do that, but at least I would hope you'd remind the member to try to focus on the sub-amendment, which Mr. Bergeron has presented in good faith to attempt to move this committee from something that has gone on from May the 16th until now. And as you know, we'll be supporting that sub-amendment if we ever get it to be voted on.
I'd like to speak to the same point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to note that, as you have said in the past, that one committee doesn't provide a precedent for another committee. So Mr. Oliphant has cited actions he may or may not have taken as chair in a different committee. Those do not provide precedent for the actions of this committee. I also just note that the amendment removes the language after the completion of the committee's studies on and replaces it with the language the committee make a decision on the studies before it on. Discussion around whether the completion of studies related to Ukraine, vaccine equity in Taiwan, as opposed to just decisions being made about those studies, and therefore the importance of the matters raised in those studies on Ukraine, vaccine equity in Taiwan, are certainly relevant. In fact, they're not only relevant, they're central to the very issue. The question of whether the study should be completed first or whether simply a decision should be made about those studies. Finally, I'll just again mention that the precedent at this committee from the House, the long practice of all committees of this House, is that members are able to speak to the issue at hand while providing context and arguments around it. And it is very unusual for people to be interrupted every couple minutes saying, well, that sentence doesn't apply, that sentence doesn't apply. So I just make note of those precedents as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jennings. Thank you, Mr.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Dr. Fry.
I would like to speak to the issue of relevance. I think that we are discussing a sub-amendment to an amendment brought forward by Mr. Genuis, which is an amendment to a motion I brought forward. I fail to see how discussing South Africa and discussing what went on in a particular government during that time has anything at all to do with either Taiwan, to do with Ukraine, to do with vaccine equity, and to do with the sub-amendment. And indeed, it is a rule of committees that relevance and repetition are two issues that can cause the chair to ask a speaker to stand down and move to the next speaker on the list. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. I just did want to note that it is important. Do you have a point of order, Mr. Albert?
Yes, if I may.
Mr. Albert?
Just a couple of things. First of all, I think the historic background that Mr. Perkins were given, I think is very, very relative to the topics that we're discussing. And I know that Mr. Oliphant knows that. The one concern I have actually is not just about this, but about the suggestion of, it seems like Mr. Oliphant trying to suggest to the chair to change the way he does things or to do his job. And I don't think that should be the case from any of us as members of this committee. I think the chair knows his job and he knows his options, and he's been doing a good job. So I believe that I'll be reserved if I was Mr. Oliphant of suggesting to the chair what he should be done and how should be run in this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abeltaif. Mr. Morantz, I understand you have a point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I do note that in Mr. Oliphant's intervention, he said that you were being lax in your enforcement of the idea of relevance. And I would just point out that really I think that you are the master of this committee, and you will decide what is relevant or what isn't and apply your own standards to that, and that Mr. Oliphant shouldn't be telling you whether you're being lax or too strict or just right.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Zuberi.
You know, I'd like to recognize how, I'm sorry to say this clearly, but you were given a very rough ride when you assumed the chair, and others were trying to tell you what to do. I think we need to note that also. But we are all equal members of this committee. If one of us, whether or not on the opposition side or the government side, is asking that we do remain focused in terms of our interventions, which makes complete sense, so we can move ahead with our work and not continue on for weeks and weeks and weeks on the same exact point of debate and conversation, getting nowhere. That they're just trying to nudge us along and help us to get to where we need to get. So again, just pleading with all members to be focused and on the issue to help us move along so we can actually make some decisions. Because at this point, that's not what's happening. Very far from it. Long speeches are being given, long interventions, history lessons, personal bios, etc. Really interested in that stuff. I'm not going to say I'm not interested in that, learning about people, colleagues, but just asking that we do stay focused so we can actually make some decisions, get to the actual work here. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Zubair. Mr. Oliphant, do you have a point of
Same,
order?
my original point of order. I would never presume to tell the chair what to do. However, by definition, a point of order is exactly what Mr. Morantz was arguing it is not. A point of order is exactly suggesting to the chair that we follow the standing orders of the committee. It has been done by Mr. Genis on numerous times where he has suggested that the chair should be doing something. So I want to be very clear about that. Absolutely. That doesn't mean I won't contest the chair at some point, because every member can always contest the chair's ruling and see if we have majority support. However, at this point, I was simply reminding the members of the committee that there is relevance, is required, it is in the standing orders, and I would hope that the chair acknowledge that that is something and either ask the member to move on or to rule the member out of order at some point, which can be done in any committee.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. Yes, I would like to remind all the members that relevance is obviously important. I think we can all agree to that. However, that having been said, I think we can all agree that relevance is somewhat of an elastic concept. So context is important, but as was noted, Mr. Bergeron actually introduced his sub-amendment in good faith. So I would ask the members to do their best to bear in mind the sub-amendment that is before us and to keep their comments relevant to the sub-amendment. Mr. Perkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members. I thought at the beginning that I had laid out the relevance about what I was about to say, and it has to do with the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia and individual Russians as a result of their illegal invasion and war against Ukraine, and the method with which the government is doing that, and that is the Special Economic Measures Act. And the context for that Special Economic Measures Act is important because I'm not sure if there are members around here who know how many times it's actually been used. There are 21 cases currently of existing sanctions that Canada has ongoing, and 7 previously that have now ended. And one of those 7 is the reason that the sanction power exists, that Parliament is not the individual arbiter every time there is a sanction proposed by the government of Canada. And so the debate and discussion, it is the governor and council that gets to set those. And part of the study in the motion is about whether or not we should be getting on with the important things of the study of Ukraine. We've just heard from witnesses from the Ukraine government, and while it was in camera, they spent quite a bit of time, and even the government members were asking questions of those witnesses relative to sanctions. So in terms of the relevance of what I'm saying, it's related to those things that clearly members have.
I would ask the chair to be very mindful of an in-camera meeting. It is parliamentary privilege, and nothing, not anything about that meeting should ever be said in a public meeting. It is a breach of the rules of Parliament. It is a very, very serious breach of the rules of Parliament to even say, even though it was in camera. I would ask the member to withdraw those and make sure that they're not put into the record of this meeting.
I certainly will. Thank you, Mr. Oliphant.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. The floor is yours.
So the purpose and the way the act came about was that after this situation happened in Haiti and the OAS decided that they wanted to impose sanctions, when the Minister of Foreign Affairs came back to Canada, we discovered that it would require a special piece of legislation related to what the OAS had done. Our approach was to say, well, we shouldn't have this. If we have to go back to Parliament, then let's go back to give the Governor and Council the authority to do this quickly, because imposing sanctions in these situations is required quickly. And as we know, even Parliament at its best, in terms of speed, can take days. And even back then, money moved fast. It moves in seconds now. So the ability of the Governor and Council to do that without having to seek parliamentary approval was critical. So, but there were fence posts put around that. And the fence post put around that was that a multilateral organization had to have called on the global community to bring in these sanctions. And that had been done through the OAS. And the OAS imposed their sanctions, but they found them after about 6 months to be leaky because it was just the Western Hemisphere. And we know that if you just do sanctions sporadically and select countries do them, other countries and other businesses will step into the breach and fill those business relationships. And that certainly happened every time we met with European members back then after the OAS had passed this, and we had passed this piece of legislation in 1991. They said, well, you know, without the UN's approval, we can't do anything because we're not members of the OAS, so we will continue to trade with Haiti. And so we then engaged on a process to get the Security Council of the United Nations, which it did in 92 and into 93, pass a resolution imposing sanctions on Haiti. Now, that's a slow process, and we're facing some of that now because we have not seen universally the countries around the world implement sanctions as we have done or as some other countries have done on the Soviet Union. In fact, we know they are trading with them. In my own backyard, the seafood industry is a big industry. Snow crab is a big industry in Newfoundland. And the price of snow crab a few months ago was $8 a pound. Now it's $3 a pound. And the reason why it's down to $3 a pound is the Japanese who are buying half of it. You're getting there.
Point of order. Now we are listening to stories about the snow crab, Mr. Speaker.
No, it's about these sanctions, leaky sanctions.
This is disgraceful that the Conservatives would continue to filibuster while we have just heard from Ukrainian parliamentarians about the need to get on with our work. We have many witnesses that have been waiting. I believe that Mr. Chen, the representative of Taiwan, is quite upset that the Conservatives are continuing this filibuster and denying the ability of witnesses on the Taiwan study. I know that the ambassador to Ukraine is similarly disappointed. Mr. Speaker, we need to stick to the topic when we debate the sub-amendment, and listening to stories of sanctions involving Haiti many years ago and the United Nations involvement there, or listening to the increased price of the snow crab is not relevant. Oh, I'm sorry. You see, when you get off topic, you lose the interest of members.
It's right on topic if you would let me finish the sentence.
Mr. Chair, I would ask that you please rule on the relevance of this and potentially face an objection to your ruling if you are to continue to rule that these matters are somehow relevant.
Mr. Chair, just on the same point of order.
Mr. Janis.
At the point at which my colleague was interrupted, he was speaking precisely about issues of sanctions right now with respect to crab, not a subject I know much about, but, I mean, the particulars of the project aren't
this is debate, Mr. Chair.
I'm responding directly to what Ms. Bendayan said. But if I could just also say on a matter of order, my colleague has imputed opinions to a number of diplomats with respect to party disagreements in this country. And I think, A, those folks are perfectly capable of speaking for themselves, and B, it's quite inappropriate to put them in the awkward situation of claiming
Mr.
they do or
Janice,
don't have a certain
This is
position.
debate,
Seems to
Mr.
me
Chair.
that you're
Debate.
engaging in debate. Do you have a point of order that you wanted to raise?
Yes, well, I think Mr. Perkins' comments were obviously relevant, and I think Ms. Bendayan's comments are out of order with respect to to claiming that certain diplomats have certain opinions about party dynamics within Canada.
Members, if I could once again remind every one of you that out of respect for other members of this committee, that we all strain and we all attempt to the best of our abilities to remain relevant to the issue at hand. Mr. Perkins, we'd be grateful if you did remain focused on making sure that your comments are relevant. Mr. Perkins, the floor is yours.
Monsieur le Président.
Point of order, Mr. President, Mr. Chair. That sub-amendment was tabled. We've been wondering what is relevant and what is not relevant. Today, what is relevant is that members of this committee want to go to work. We all know how we are going to vote. It's really shameful what we are experiencing here today. I just got here. I think it's a pity. It's a pity because we are all paid to do our work, but right now we are not doing the work for which we are being paid. That's all, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Giuseppe. Again, I think it's pretty clear and obvious that all the members are concerned about ensuring that our comments do remain relevant. That having been said, I also wanted to remind all of you that this meeting will be over at 12 o'clock. So I am advised by the clerk that resources have not been provided beyond 12 o'clock since our meeting did start at 10. So, Mr. Perkins, if I could ask that you, again, try your utmost to remain relevant in your comments. Thank you.
Well, and just to finish on the snow crab issue, the snow crab issue is that Japan has filled in and is buying snow crab from Russia, a G7 partner, providing them with cash. That's the relevance, and has abandoned their contracts in Newfoundland directly to the leaky sanctions. So with that in mind, I believe, given the discussion around the table, that a motion to adjourn debate is in order.
Okay. Is there unanimous? What's that?
He doesn't need UC. He's just moving.
Oh, okay. So we're going to have to take a vote on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The vote is on the motion that the debate be now adjourned. Ms. Bendayan.
No.
Dr. Fry.
Sorry, clerk, I'm trying to unmute myself. No.
Mr. Oliphant.
No.
Mr. Sarai.
No.
Mr. Zuberi.
No, thank you.
Mr. Abeltaif.
Yes.
Mr. Van Popta.
Yes.
Mr. Janice.
Yes.
Mr. Morantz.
Yes.
Monsieur Brunet-Duceppe.
No.
Ms. McPherson.
No.
Mr. Chair, that is 7 nays, 4 yeas.
Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Ms. McPherson.
I would just like it put on the record that the discussion today is about a study on the reproductive rights of women. And once again, we have
No, it isn't.
five
It's on the
conservative
amendment.
men
point of order,
in this
Mr. Chair.
room speaking about why
point of order, Mr. Chair.
we cannot look at the reproductive rights of women.
Is this a
I just
matter
want
of
that on the record.
debate,
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Chair?
Chair.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson.
is
Now,
that a point of
the
debate
time
or order?
currently stands at 12. I'm sure some will be happy, others not so happy, that we're going to have to suspend the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.